speaker, Dr. Lizzie Collingham, here in an appropriate venue for the subject that she's going to be talking about. This is the second lecture dinner, whatever we call it, that we've held here at Cafe Spice. The food last time was absolutely great, and we expect it to be great this time too. We're very grateful to Cyrus Todibala and Kurt Todibala for hosting us again. They've worked very hard to make this a memorable evening, as have several members of the Guild Committee, especially Heather Grant, our events coordinator. So thank you to all of them. Lizzie Collingham received her BA in History at the University of Sussex and her PhD at Cambridge, where she was later a research fellow. She's the author of 3 books: Imperial Bodies, The Physical Experience of the Raj; Curry, A Tale of Cooks and Conquerors and the Taste of War; World War II and the Battle for Food. She is now an independent historian, and she lives in Cambridge. And she's here tonight to talk to us about, and I can't wait to find out what it is exactly, curry, tinned cheese, and famine. Please welcome Lizzie Collingham.
In this talk, I wanted to take you on my personal journey of my encounter with Indian history, how it led me to become interested in food and food history, and my fascination with food as a lens through which to re-examine history. So it's my personal take on India through food. So in the 17th century, the English factory at Surat, which was on the western coast of India, was a very isolated, remote trading post where a handful of men led a very collegiate life, really. It was very much, it reminds me constantly when I read about it, of Cambridge or an Oxford College, on the margins of Indian society. And on Sunday afternoons, after service, with the chaplain, the merchants would climb into their palanquins and were carried to their walled garden just outside the city. And here, amid a beautiful greenery and a tinkling water and so on, some of them would bathe, some of them would smoke their hookahs dreamily while they played board games. Dutch gentlewomen, now don't ask me why they were Dutch, I've never been able to work out why English men had Dutch women serving them, would serve them with fruit and collations of fruit and preserves and so on, and they would sip on arak punch, which was made with arak, rose water, sugar, lemon juice and spices, and it sounds quite potent, because when the young German Albert Mandelsloh visited the factory in 1638, he describes how the men were commemorating the day they had left England, and they kept on toasting their wives until, as he said, they had drunk more than they could well carry away. So besides adopting Indian pastimes, the merchants also really enjoyed Indian food. So the chaplain, John Ovington, visited the community in 1689, and he discovered an Indian, a Portuguese, and an English cook working in the kitchen. And when he was dining with the merchants, he enjoyed spicy kebabs with garlic and spices and herbs, or he also had dump-poked chicken, which was stuffed with almonds, smothered with butter and spices, and then cooked in a pot, and pilaus, of course. But many of the dishes that a European encountering in India then would not have seemed particularly exotic to them. Edward Terry, who was part of Thomas Rowe's deputation to the Emperor Jahangir, mentions particularly enjoying a dish called mangi real, which was pounded chicken mixed up with almonds and sugar and ambergris, which can't be particularly nice, so I was thinking. I'd love to taste some ambergris. If anybody ever has, do come and tell me afterwards what it tastes like. And this would have been very much like blancmange, which you find in 17th century English cookbooks all the time. So it wouldn't have been particularly strange to them. So it isn't very surprising to find these English merchants living in an isolated 17th century community adopted some of the pleasanter pastimes of their hosts. But what is more surprising is that even once the East India Company had become established, and it was one of India's ruling powers in the early 19th century, company merchants still adopted many Indian practices. So you could find them lolling about on cushions, in white pyjamas, very loose clothing, smoking a hookah, and watching a nautch of dancing girls. And I started out life as a cultural historian, so I was writing a PhD about the British body in India. And what intrigued me was the fact that India was consciously integrated into these men's identities. So early 19th century Orientalist scholarship argued that the British were returning India to its ancient laws, to a sort of mythical golden age which had been lost under the Mughals. And it was therefore appropriate, if they were ruling in an Indian idiom, to transform themselves into an Indian-style elite. India was so much a part of these men's identities that when they returned to Britain, they would refer to themselves as an Indian, or an East Indian, or an Anglo-Indian. And you can find them dressing up in Indian clothes to have their portraits painted. So Captain John Foote, I don't know if you know the outfit in the V&A, it's absolutely exquisite. You can see the outfit that he was painted in by Joshua Reynolds in 1765, I think. And in damp grey England, they pined for India. So Charles Cockrell, he built himself Sesin Coat in Gloucestershire. It's this beautiful house. And at either end of this long house, it has two little garden pavilions. And on the ceiling of the garden pavilions, he had silver stars painted so that he could imagine himself back under the Indian night sky. So these men longed for India and identified with it. One of the most direct ways to integrate India into your body was to ingest it. And the British in India demonstrated their status. Remember, they were being an elite, a high-status Indian elite. And well into the 19th century, Indian dishes were an important part of every meal. Emma Roberts, who was a very sour spinster, who accompanied her married sister out to India in the 1830s, was nasty about the British in India, and she described their sumptuous meals, which she most disapproved of. And they would do this twice a day, she claimed. So at a really good dinner, you would have a turkey that you couldn't see over, stewed beef, boiled beef, loin of veal, roast capons, and it would all be paraded down the table, and in between would be bowls of curry and rice. Now, what's frustrating is that commentators describe all the dishes of meat in great detail, but they don't tell you anything about the curry and rice, except to say that sometimes the curry was hot, which is a bit neat. But early recipe books from the time do show that the British were aware that curries had different names and were different dishes. And they just used curry to encompass all Indian dishes. So where did the term come from? And no self-respecting Indian at that time would call his meal a curry. So what did it mean to the British? And the British seem to have picked up the term from the Portuguese, who described all the Indian broths as carrion or curry. And they, the Portuguese, in turn seem to have picked it up from a South Indian language. But in South Indian language, as I'm told by my experts, linguist friends, at that point, it wouldn't have meant a sauce or a dish or a gravy. It would have meant a spice mixture, a very specific spice mixture. So it's a bit of a mystery why everything Indian was called curry, but in the end, that's what it was. Now, the evolution of korma very nicely illustrates what the English did to curries. So korma began life, and I don't really know how to pronounce this, as kaurama, which was a dish of tender pieces of lamb or chicken braised in oil. And that's in Akbar's court, you can find recipes for kaurama that is just very simple like that. However, as Persian cooks came into Akbar's court and influenced the cooking there, you find it gets first marinated in yogurt with ginger and garlic and spices, which is a very Persian technique. And then they add almonds to the sauce so to thicken it up, which is another Persian trick. And then in the 18th century, Delhi starts to decline and oud rises. So the cooks and the musicians and the artists and the poets and so on all went to oud in the 18th century. And there, it's the centre of dairy culture, really, in India. And there they added cream to make a really rich, voluptuous dish. But when it came to making panorama for the British, the author of the Indian Cookery Book warned his readers that it was one of the richest Hindustani curries and quite unsuited to European taste if made according to the original recipe. Now, his alternative recipe reduced the ghee, reduced the yogurt, omitted the cream, and instead of using aromatic cloves like cardamom, spices like cloves and cardamom, he substituted things like chilies and coriander. And the adapted version bore only a passing resemblance to a Lucknowi paratha, which is what's happening. So the British had invented their very own dish, curry. Now, a British curry was based on a paste of onions, garlic and ginger, mixed with a standard set of spices, added all at once rather than separately at different stages of the cooking process. And eventually these spices came pre-packaged, so you could get curry powders available in hot, medium and mild. And you could basically stew any kind of meat in this paste, and it was a curry. Now, a British curry was incomplete if you didn't add a wide range of condiments. So they picked up Indian practice of putting boiled eggs on some things and bommel on fish, desiccated coconuts, sultanas. These might all be added to particular Indian dishes. The British just took all of them and just went, yummy, and put them on any curry. That was basically a curry. And you can still get that when I had curry in the UL library at Cambridge, they have this big array of all these things that you could sprinkle on your curry. So curry is a particularly satisfying dish for a historian to unpick. It reveals India's history of cultural exchange, Persian, British, Hindustani, all mixing up. And fascinatingly, for me, the British interpretation of Indian food mirrored the British interpretation of Indian society. So in the process of classifying India's complex cookery, the British simplified it and put it down to a scheme. Now, the same approach was applied to India's complex social relationships. So these were reduced to a rigid and hierarchical understanding of the caste system. And it's this parallel between food history and wider historical processes which really fascinates me. So East India Company merchants took their British versions of curry back to Britain, and here Victorian cooks thought curry was great for using up cold meat. And if the recipe books are to be believed, Victorians would curry anything from a sheep's head to periwinkles, neither of which sounds at all pleasant. But while British interest in India was growing, in India the tide was beginning to turn against the easy assimilation of India into British identity. Officials had always worried that too much time in an enervating climate might lead to degeneration. And there are even pictures of company officials coming back with brown skin. Warren Hastings' trial had made them think that acting the despot in India might have a bad effect on your man's moral integrity. The rising tide of evangelicalism and utilitarianism recast East India Company men. So rather than restoring India to its ancient self, their mission was now to bring India into the modern age. The government focused on promoting English language education for Indians. It outlawed disturbing practices such as widow burning, and a company official was about there to neutrally administer the law. That's the rhetoric. Now that they were carriers of Western civilization, it wasn't acceptable for them to socialise with Indians or lie around in white baggy clothes smoking a hookah, or to have an Indian mistress, or to consume Indian food. So on more and more occasions, the British official was expected to wear black broadcloth, the uniform really of the English middle class profession. And the very discomfort and impracticality of this suit underlined his decision to uphold British values. Until the 1860s, it was possible to arrive at a dinner party, and if you had a very kind host, they might suggest that you change into the white jacket, which you would have handily brought with you and slip on. But by 10 years later, in the 1870s, one dressed in full evening dress for dinner, whether one had guests or not, and there was no talk of changing into white jackets. And the attempt to exclude the Orient even extended to women's clothes. So in London, you might wear this beautiful Indian textiles filigreed with silver and gold, which you can also see in the V&A. No British woman in India would have been seen dead dining in such stuff. She might have been mistaken for a nautch girl. Signs of the Orient were removed from the table. No hookahs was often printed on invitations. The British began lugging out great crates of white British-made porcelain to India, as plain as possible, so there's no mistake it's British. When in Calcutta, in foreign, you could buy beautiful, cheaply Chinese-made ones, but they weren't going to do that. So on their nice plain British plates, they followed the English fashion of serving the food in courses and drinking different wines with each course. And it was very difficult to distinguish on paper the difference between a British Indian and a British meal. So John William Lang is eating dinner with friends in Bombay in 1873, and he has fillets of fish in parsley sauce, breast of mutton compote, mutton and chicken pie, Italian eggs, and baked lemon custard. That's it. A reviewer expressed a widely held opinion when he remarked that the point of a recipe book for India is to teach us not how to prepare certain dishes peculiar to the country, but how best to produce under the special circumstances of the country dishes approved by the taste of polite society at home. So, early in the day, or at tiffin, or in camp, or at the club at lunchtime, you might have had a curry, but at dinner you had your nice British soup, entree, roast meat, savoury dessert. Okay, these British dinners didn't taste very nice. The meat was often recently slaughtered and therefore a bit tough. The dishes were prepared by Indian cooks who had no concept of the end product which they were aiming for. And they couldn't help adding a few spices to this terribly bland thing that the Memsahib had ordered. So often, you get quite eccentric interpretations of French dishes on the menus written down by Indian butlers. So you might get green pea souffle appearing as giving peace soupli. And the same sort of thing went on in the food as well. So the result was a very distinctive Anglo-Indian cuisine of masala roasts and cutlets. And actually, I think tonight we're probably going to be sampling a cutlet, because these were cold meat, rolled in mashed potatoes, probably with a bit of spices put in, and coated in breadcrumbs and fried. And that sounds very much like our starter, which is haggis and chorizo croquettes. So that'll be interesting. I've never had an Anglo-Indian cutlet. Sounds a bit fancier. So, to assist in all this anglicisation, market gardens sprung up around European settlements, growing cauliflowers and cabbages and so on. European and New World vegetables quickly became popular among Indians as well, and they gave them the Indian treatment. And again, we're going to sample an Indian treatment of some European vegetables in some Bombay coleslaw. And we're going to have tomato rice. And that's a good reminder that these New World things like tomatoes and potatoes now seem to us like integral parts of Indian cooking, but they were actually introduced to Indians and India by the British in the 18th century. So the British also imported vast quantities, and I mean really vast, of tinned, bottled and preserved foods into India, which is where we come to our tinned cheese. So in April 1834, Shepherd & Co. advertised that you could go to their warehouses in Calcutta and get American ox tongues, pine, Warwickshire and Berkeley cheeses in tins, olive oil, salad oil, mustard, vinegar, whole anchovies, capers, hermetically sealed oysters, blue raisins, French macaroni, fruit for tarts, fine little plump Yorkshire hams. Now, all these delicacies at first combined well with Indian dishes. So in the 1830s, I found an army captain, and he was enjoying for tiffin Yorkshire ham, coast mutton, when he needs Indian mutton, hot curry, and English cheese. But increasingly, products such as tinned asparagus and oysters and so on were used to assist in the production of very purely British meals. So we think of tinned food today as rather cheap and down market. But when they were first appeared in the early 19th century, the working classes actually shunned them, quite rightly, thinking that they might poison you. And it was a decided disadvantage that a lot of the early canned food had at best a faint metallic tang, and at worst tasted really nauseous. But besides feeding the army, explorers, the navy, the tin food fed the colonial officials, and they had really gourmet tastes. So Fanny Parks finds tins of foie gras and truffles for sale in the native bazaar in Bengal. And Huntley and Palmer biscuit tins could be found all over the subcontinent, and it was said that Himalayan shepherds would exchange a week's worth of sheep's milk for a Huntley and Palmer biscuit tin. So the production of processed foods and their import and re-export became a very important part of Britain's industrial economy. And regardless of their place of origin, these processed foods symbolised home to the colonials. So a Warwickshire cheese was just as much a reminder of home as Worcestershire sauce, which was Indian, or originally came from an Indian recipe, or jars of turtle soup, and after all the turtle will have come from the Caribbean, or American ox tongues, which were from the buffalo, which were fast disappearing from America's plains. But they were all viewed as bringing the taste of England into India. By the 20th century, British society in India had become an outdated parody, really, of English aristocratic life. The colonial elite, who were largely drawn from the British middle classes, still insisted on aristocratic practices. So you still had to make afternoon calls, you left your visiting cards addressed for dinner, and even among the British aristocracy, these habits were disappearing. But they were an important enactment of distinction, and tinned foods were part of it, and these all buttressed this archaic colonial culture. Now, the language of distinction, which the British spoke through food, was easily read and understood by their Indian subjects, and those Indians with the means demonstrated that they were fully in command of this language. So, in the 1830s, the Nawab of Lucknow had an English, a French, and a Hindustani dinner served along his table. Stories abound of elite families, Indian families, Maharajas and so on, employing English and French cooks. But my favourite story is from a guy called Prakash Tandon, who was a middle-class Indian employee of Unilever in 1930s India. And he's invited to dine with a princely family in Hyderabad. And he's so excited, he's really anticipating this wonderful meal. And he gets there and they sit down and they get watery soup, minced chops, fried fish, roast mutton and a steamed pudding, instead of what he'd been anticipating. But once the English meal is cleared away, they get a succession of pilau, biryani, korma, quails, naan bread, and these are all served, and the family who've been picking at their English food tuck in with great gusto, and he thinks, oh no, I ate the English food to be polite, I haven't got any more room. So he has to squeeze in some nice Indian food. Now, of course, food practices were only one of the ways in which the British demonstrated their Britishness. They played British sports, they hunted, they went on expeditions, they had imperial ceremonies, the social routines of the club. All this wove a very complex web of British practices around the colonial elite. Now, just as colonial anthropology divided people into ethnic groups who could be distinguished by their physical experience, their style of dress, their language, their suitability for particular types of labour, and their diet, which they talk about a lot, so the British were defined by their black suits and their depressingly bland food. Just as anthropology defined cultural habits as hereditary characteristics, which kept the Indians in their subservient place, so the habits surrounding colonial officials defined them. And British prestige relied upon this performance of Britishness to keep officials in their superior position. Now, the Indian elite's demonstration of their ability to master English food habits was a form of resistance, a refusal to stay in their proper place. Now, cultural history led me to explore the powerful language of food. But I began my professional life as a cultural historian, and I rejected the history of kings and queens which were forced upon me at school. But as I've got older, I have found it more and more difficult to ignore the political history of food. So now we get to the depressing part of my talk. So when I began work on my book on food in the Second World War, I had a vague notion that cultural meanings of food in wartime would be interesting. But it very quickly became apparent that the politics of food and war were much more compelling. And the exploration of the way in which the issue of food security can be, you can argue that it causes the Second World War as one of the causes, took me back in the last quarter of the 19th century, when popular enthusiasm in Britain for the empire was growing. So exhibitions fueled the imagination. You could wander around a reconstructed Indian village with jugglers and elephants, and you could sample curry in one of the Indian restaurants, which you would often reach across a lake, and it was all very romantic. Bottles of spicy sauce and Indian relishes with names like Empress of India or Nabob's Mandarin were appearing on working class tables, not just middle class tables now. And railways and steamships had changed the working class diet. It had brought down transport costs and made food cheaper. A new global food economy was emerging in the last quarter of the 19th century, and Britain was transferring the job of growing food to its colonies. So the diet of the urban working classes was really linked to the rest of the world now. The wheat to make their soft white bread came from America. Their tea from India. The sugar to sweeten that tea and to put in the jam, which they spread on their bread, came from Mauritius and Fiji. And frozen and tinned meat, which was starting to make more of an appearance on the working class table, was coming from Argentina and Australia. Now, in some ways, this diet was nutritionally deficient because too much white bread, not wholemeal bread, too many calories from sugar. But they were getting more meat. It had gone up from about 16 kilograms per head in 1870 to about 50 per head in 1940. So there is some improvement. However, while the fortunes of the British working classes were improving, those of the artisans of India and China were in decline. Now, the Deccan was a core region in the 18th century trade world of commerce, producing fine cotton. Artisans here probably had a more wholesome and satisfying diet than their equivalents in Europe. But by the end of the 19th century, the situation had been reversed. So railways and roads had made their way into the rural districts of India and opened up previously isolated farmers to the possibility of selling their produce, not just in local markets, but regional and international markets. So between 1875 and 1900, the annual grain exports from India rose from 3 million tonnes to 15 million. In 1900, 1/5 of Britain's wheat came from India. So rather than holding back a surplus to ensure themselves against years of scarcity, peasants sold their surpluses on this world market. However, this made them very vulnerable to international price fluctuations and to the vagaries of the climate. And throughout the last half of the 19th century and well into the 20th, India was hit by a series of droughts and inadequate harvests, which meant that the peasants who had to buy in food and wage labourers were forced to borrow at extortionate rates in order to buy in food from the money lenders. So they became indebted. Those who could no longer afford to buy food, mostly landless, wageless wage labourers, they starved to death. So between 1870 and 1900, as many as 60 million Chinese and Indian died as a result of the appalling famines. That's double the number who died of starvation, I think, during the Second World War. So each famine increased the number of impoverished and indebted peasants. Even in good years, most of the profits went to the middlemen and the money lenders and were siphoned off. The railways were a double-edged sword. They brought in relief if the government chose to bring in relief, but they meant that the poor now had to negotiate their entitlement to food in the context of an international trade in grain. And so while Britain's industrial classes gained some bargaining room on this stage, the colonial peasantry lost. And between the First and Second World Wars, you have a brief respite, there's a lull from famine. But in 1939, it's clear that the peasant farmers living at the margins of subsistence are going to be extremely vulnerable to the disruptions of war. U-boats were a serious source of concern to Britain, but their threat was so great precisely because Britain continued to rely on food imports throughout the war. So Britain received a steady supply of palm oil to make margarine from West Africa, bacon from Canada, butter, cheese from New Zealand, corned beef from Argentina, spam, more dried egg than anybody really wanted from America. 56% of the population's calorific needs were met during the war by imports. Britain's ability to rely on the agricultural resources of its empire and the Commonwealth was its strength. In Britain, strict price controls and rationing protected the civilians from wartime inflation. But the British government and its colonial administrations around the empire were far less willing to intervene to protect Britain's more vulnerable colonial subjects from the negative impact of war. Indeed, the British government chose to sacrifice its colonial subjects to hunger and famine rather than to allow British civilians to suffer. And this is an aspect of the Second World War which isn't much talked about and which really, if you look at the war through food, comes into sharp focus. So the merits of Operation Torch, which were the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942, have been endlessly debated from a military perspective. Was Churchill right to push for this rather than opening a second front in Europe? Did the fighting in North Africa really do anything to help the war, and so on? But it's a very rare military historian who asks, was it worth the huge numbers of colonial deaths it helped to make certain? Operation Torch was a disaster for millions who went hungry as a result of the colonies. The preparations alone cost Britain a 30% reduction in imports in 1942. Now I've made the point, imports were really important to feeding the British population, so that's a real problem. Britain didn't have enough ships to meet all its commitments. After the landings in North Africa, the shipping shortage became much worse, and Churchill decided to prioritise. Supplying the army in North Africa with food and equipment came first, British civilian food imports came second, and something was going to have to give. And in early 1943, Churchill ordered that the shipping to the Indian Ocean should be cut by 60%. The decision came at the worst possible moment for the people of Bengal. From the beginning of the war, the Indian government, and that's British employees, officials, and Indian politicians by name, had presided over a mounting food crisis. they had failed to control inflation or introduce rationing, and that as each week went by, labourers in the town and in the countryside, all wage earners, were able to afford less and less food. And in Amartya Sen's very famous phrase, they were losing their entitlement to food. Now in Bengal, a combination of crop failure, which is debatable, the removal of rice stores and goats in border areas to prevent the Japanese from getting hold of them, raging inflation, meant that by 1943, rice had virtually disappeared from the food markets. Even if they could have afforded it, it wasn't there. Artisans and labourers had nothing to buy. And at the same time that Churchill made his decision to cut shipping, hundreds of thousands of Bengalis had been reduced to skeletons, squatting or lying listlessly by the road, waiting silently for death. That summer, a journalist described a slow, dispirited, noiseless army drifting into Calcutta, lying down, often in front of a food store, and dying. So the decision to divert shipping from the Indian Ocean meant that no help was available. Viceroy Linlithgow's request for 200,000 tons of grain in April 1943 was met with the response from Churchill and his cabinet that India must feel the pinch like the rest of the empire. A cabinet committee was set up to look into the question of food supplies for India, and it reported that the risk of Indian civilian hunger, they didn't acknowledge at this point that the risk was by then a reality. The risk was a lesser evil than jeopardising British civilian food supplies or supplies for the military. Offers of wheat from Canada were turned down for lack of shipping. The UNRWA, the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, was blocked by the British government. They didn't want UN officials snooping around exposing British incompetence, so they wouldn't take their food. It was not until Wavell was appointed as Viceroy in September 1943 that decisive relief action was taken, and Wavell sent repeated telegrams to London asking for assistance, but was often met with hostility. He does eventually get a few thousand tons of grain from the military in Southeast Asia. To be fair to Churchill, he did prove equally resistant when it came to helping the Dutch, who were suffering a hunger winter in 1944 to 45. But the American public opinion, the Dutch government in exile, and the British government were pressurised by pressure groups like Oxfam and people like that, and they managed to persuade him that he must send in relief, and the American military. But Wavell watched all this with bitterness, remarking a very different attitude exists towards a starving population when starvation is in Europe. About 3 million Bengalis died. Localised starvation in the south didn't develop into outright famine, but you found a lot of corpses by the side of the road in the south. Famine struck in East Africa, especially in Tanganyika, and the poor islanders of Mauritius, who depended on sugar exports, which nobody wanted anymore, throughout the entire war, did not receive a single cargo of lentils, which was the main source of protein in their diet, while the British population ended the war noticeably healthier than when it had begun. The Mauritians in 1945 were severely malnourished. So it's all too easy to claim that famine in poor countries was the result of natural disaster. The British government was powerless to prevent it or ameliorate it. These wartime famines and the widespread malnutrition in the colonies was not the result of natural forces. This was man-made, war-related hunger and starvation. It was inevitable that the wartime disruption to the world's food economy would lead to hunger. It's difficult to conclude that anything other than racism was the guiding principle which determined where it would strike. Churchill and his war cabinet decided to displace hunger onto India and the colonies in the Indian Ocean. They may not have worked out an explicit policy to export wartime hunger to the empire, but this is in fact what the British government did. So a view of the war from the perspective of food does much to qualify the familiar narrative of the Allies as a force for good against evil.
like to ask. Can you introduce yourself when you're asking questions?
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm just going to say I love your book, sorry. Does the fact that there was political pressure from the Indian, it wasn't in Liverpool, was it? It was putting pressure on Churchill to
Was
separate.
great,
Yeah.
That was a bit of a punch.
Does that suggest that actually the British and India weren't suffering, it was just the Indian problem?
Oh, yeah.
So were there any shortages for the colonials?
No.
So they were just carrying on to
I mean, Martin Sen has written a very famous book on the Bengal famine, and he argues that there was absolutely no food shortage whatsoever in Bengal. What had happened was the merchants had seen this is classic wartime inflation. Yeah, they see that the prices of food are going up. They hoard the food and they keep it in stores and they wait until the price has gone up to make more money. So his argument is that there was plenty of food in Bengal to feed everybody. New research suggests that perhaps people had hoarded food because they realised there was a very serious shortage of food, and that they weren't being quite so capitalistic about hoarding it. But no, the British in India, and in Calcutta was fair, because the British were very worried that if Calcutta, the city which is next to the Japanese who are beginning to attack on, or thinking of attacking on that border, you can't have Calcutta there. So food is taken into Calcutta, but in the villages the people die. It's the middle classes and the landless wage labourers in particular who all rely on buying food every day that die.
They must have presumably not had all of their nice imported kind of tin.
No, they did have to take a cut on that, although I think you'll still find that a few nice imported tins did make their way to India. But there are books about how we should need to cook with okra now and stuff like that. Terrible. Must have been awful.
How much has there been left of food culture from the Empire since 1948? Have you got a view on that?
In India?
In India, yes.
I feel an Indian really ought to answer that, because I haven't been to India for a very long time. In the 1960s, it was really still very strong. My supervisor talks about that. And when I went there in the 1990s for the first time, it was still there. You would still get, big hotels and stuff would serve you cucumber sandwiches and weird chocolate sponge cake and stuff like that. So there was still there. But I'm told by people who have been more recently than I have, that is starting to die away. And now, although I was interviewed a few weeks ago by television, because British cooks were now taking British curry back to a festival in Calcutta. So, and if you go to a big restaurant in India, to a posh hotel or something, chicken tikka masala and things like that, which are clearly British curries, will be on the menu. So there is definitely an exchange. But the kind of really Anglo-Indian, sort of British in India, cucumber sandwiches and weird sponge cake, which doesn't look like sponge cake, that's probably dying.
Thank you.
Can I just add to that? I grew up in Pakistan. My name is Sohail, and I can answer your question. I grew up in Pakistan, and we have a lot of colonial clubs, gentlemen clubs that still left over. And I'll promise you, a lot of the stuff that's on the menu is preserved with great respect. A lot of things that they learned from the British, like fried fish and club sandwiches and cucumber sandwiches.
Chicken sandwiches and tolly
They are possibly, all the guys who still cook in the kitchens are ones that cook when the British were there. And they have preserved those recipes.
Okay, so it's
And they are
still there.
sacred. I mean, you go there, you don't really go and eat the curry, you go and eat the British food. Because it's still very, very much.
And that's still going on.
Absolutely.
Because I haven't been to India for a while, so I feel kind of bad.
Firstly, I've read your book and it's absolutely fabulous. I've read it many times actually. My question is, and I've read several books on Indian history written by British people. Whether during the research, any research is done from the other side, books that have been written by Indian people about the British Raj?
There aren't that many. The Indian researchers, all way in which the British Raj had influenced communalism, and so very political stuff. And they didn't tend to use the British Raj, so you don't tend to get.
Because there are books on the Indian perspective as well. You know, like you mentioned.
In Indian language.
Yes,
Yeah,
which are translatable, easily translatable.
Yeah.
You know, in your book you mentioned about how curries were used to use leftover meat.
Yes.
Whereas that was completely against the principle of Indian cooking. Completely against. So even today when we talk about British food still remaining in India or in the Indian subcontinent, it's a very, very small percentage. In a country that has over 1 billion people, there is probably 0.1% eating cucumber sandwiches.
Yes, it's not really. I mean,
So it really didn't make much impact. And in fact, if one looks from the other side, from within India, a lot of what happened in the British Raj was absolutely no. You know, you couldn't use leftovers because you know in your research that an Indian person will not eat leftovers, will not eat something touched by another person. So all those rules were completely dismissed.
Exactly. I think the main influence that the British had on Indian cooking really was the vegetables.
Cauliflower and cabbage.
Cauliflower, potatoes. I mean, Bengal, the potatoes became extremely important for the peasantry and the poor in Bengal because they're really easy to grow and they're very highly nutritious. So that's not really, I mean, the potato isn't really English, but that's, I would say, and tea, of course.
And
they persuaded the Indians
because,
to drink
you know,
tea.
to me it's always interesting to read about, it would be interesting to read about this side as well, because obviously many books write about the British experience of, you know, coming and eating the food that you mentioned.
Yes.
But what were those books thinking?
I
They
know.
actually did more.
It would be fantastic. And you know that I found in the India office, there's one account that I could find of a cook, and apparently he talks all about things, and he talks about his mistress hitting him with a hairbrush. But it's not, you're not allowed to read it till the person who gave it, its grandchildren have died, so I can't read it.
But I would be very happy to send you some links.
I would, yeah.
Because there are texts that talk about food in the 12th
Sadly, I
century.
can't read Indian language, it's a
No,
terrible
the translation is
very
very
remiss.
interesting.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to ask what you said about the diet of the urban working class in the final quarter of the 19th century was fascinating. I had no idea that they would be eating spicy sauces from a bottle and that sort of thing.
Yeah, by that time, from about when Victoria is announced as Empress of India, there is a sort of big Raj excitement, and there are musical songs, and there's a bit of a debate about whether the empire really did touch people's lives and whether they really did pay any attention. But in terms of food, I really think it did. And you will, several people that I interviewed for the Second World War then talked about how their mum would make piccalilli, which of course was a sort of weird English version of Indian pickles, and that was Christmas time food. And things like the sauces and so on, they do start appearing on working class tables and, you know, cheer things up. So yeah, definitely, the working classes diet starts to improve from about the 1870s to 1914. And of course, they have a long way to go, but yeah, that's, the empire is, well, it feeds them, really. And a few pickles and relishes were definitely there. I mean, I don't think you'd have got working class women cooking curry. It would have been condiments, yeah.
I'm from Kerala, and we're answering the question, the colonial influence in the Indian food. Kerala is the place where all the foreigners came in for spices, Portuguese, English, and Chinese, Arabs, all. And our food has a very strong English influence. We have got a dish called ishtu, which is stew, the white stew. We make it with little bit of spices. It's white in color. It's with chicken, carrot, all the English vegetables. But instead of milk, we add coconut milk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you often got substitutes
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
And then we have cutlets. It's like croquettes, but with ginger, garlic, onion, garam masala. It's again English influence. And we have puddings, the custard puddings, and Christmas we always have the fruit cake, and that kind of, because the Kerala is the place where colonials and all the people there. And the influence is very, very high, and still it remains.
And still has.
Still it remains. And said that there is no word called curry in Indian language. But in Kerala, we have so many curries. From olden days, in Tamil, sauce means kulambu, whereas in Kerala, curry means sauce. So probably, I'm not sure,
There must have been some
there must have been
mixing.
some pieces
No one
where,
can untangle it for me, and there's lots of linguistic people sort of
Yeah.
trying to. No, I don't think it's lost.
No.
Now that gets into the language.
because Portuguese came into Kerala, English people
Exactly.
came into Kerala,
Yes,
and we have got so many curries. Curry means sauce in Kerala.
That's very interesting.
No other questions? Okay, let's thank our speaker once again, please.